Every journey has its mountains and its valleys. As a very young child, the first time my father explained to me that some people did not believe in the Christian God, I was utterly shocked. I had not realized that there might be grounds for disbelief. I had assumed that God was known and worshipped by everyone. Even at the time of my first crisis of faith, when I was 17 years old, I had yet to meet an atheist. I reached a valley in my journey before any mountain, so I had no experiences to cling to on the side of faith or on that of skepticism. My struggle was waged internally in the only way I really knew, by talking to God. Prayer had become a significant part of my life early on. Oftentimes I would talk to God silently in my mind as I would go about my day. I would ask for His protection when I was afraid, ask for His assistance when I wanted something, and ask for understanding when I was confused. I would also regularly praise God in my prayers, but despite all of this I never heard an audible voice or felt any different than when I would have a mental dialogue with my conscience. I nonetheless told myself God was communicating with me, especially after my prayers would appear to be answered, though if I had truly been honest with myself and dug very deep down inside, I might have confessed that the conversations always seemed unsatisfactory and very one-sided. Even so, I prayed continuously to be like David, who was known as a man after God's own heart. But when the questions began to pile up, I began to wonder about the effectiveness of prayer. I prayed long and hard for the right way to approach my non-Christian friends, and I prayed for greater insight into the issues that were troubling me, so I could be a better witness to others. The focus of prayer was not on me, and even when I occasionally would ask for something, like a date with one of the hot neighbor girls, it would always be qualified with, "if it be your will." I had taken into account almost every Christian opinion on how one should pray to God, and yet I found no strength from prayer during my crisis of faith. How could I tell the difference between God's voice and my conscience? Were my prayers really being answered, or was I just desperately wanting to believe they were? Was perhaps everything I had been raised to believe imaginary? I had been wrestling with these sorts of questions for months, and one night as I was sitting in my car waiting to pick up my brother from work and staring out across quiet open fields under the starlight, everything flooded into my mind at once. It overwhelmed me with a sensation like that of an exhausted man in deep waters, fighting not to drown. I had not renounced my faith, only begun to doubt and question it, but soon feelings of guilt crept in. If you walk away from God, then what? Why even try to be a good person if you're not accountable to anyone? What might happen to you if you leave the protection of God? Flawed and presumptuous as these questions are, I did not recognize it at the time. I had no answers, so as these struggles brought my world crashing down around me, my only reaction was to break down in tears. I had failed in my quest to be a man after God's own heart. I wanted nothing more than to believe and help guide others to the truth, but I wasn't even sure of what the truth was anymore. I had no circle of friends in a youth group to turn to, no leaders at my church to lean on for support, and I finally felt abandoned, even by God Himself. For those who have never been religious, it may be difficult to understand the experience of a crisis of faith. Think of a time when you felt like you had horribly failed someone you loved very dearly, when they had never been anything but good to you. Perhaps they left you feeling hopelessly alone and heartbroken to the point of sensing a physical weight in your chest, like the heart inside of you had become an unbearable burden. At least in my experience, this was how I felt. Christianity was all I'd really known, and so my world was turned upside down and inside out when I began to question it. I stayed a Christian all the while, though, out of guilt, fear, and ignorance of the alternatives. My reaction to the breakdown I had that night was to get right with God, and I suspected that my doubts were coming from a lack of fellowship. I had no one to help inspire me or hold me accountable in my walk with Christ, I thought, thus I had started to backslide in faith. I decided to seek out a youth group at another church, while the one at my own church was still relatively dead. The first youth group I went to visit was a disappointment in many ways, but when the leaders split us all up into small groups, things changed. I remained silent practically the entire night, listening as one of the adults in our small group talked about the struggles young people face and the questions believers of all ages often wrestle with. "We do have answers for these issues," he said. "God has given us reasons to believe. He hasn't just left us in the dark with nothing." I was amazed at the relevance of our small group discussion to the crisis that was going on in my own life. I had not mentioned this to anyone at the church, and it seemed like God had finally heard my prayer and responded. When the group leader recommended Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, to us, I made note of it and went out to buy the book the next day. The Case for Christ was my introduction to Christian apologetics. Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, meaning to speak in defense of something, and thus Christian apologetics is the defense of Christian faith against its skeptics and critics. Specifically, Lee Strobel's book is a defense of the evangelical Christian perspective on Jesus, namely his resurrection and divinity. I went into the Case for Christ eager to be strengthened in my faith and given new tools to use in witnessing, but I finished the book feeling quite unimpressed. The first thing I noticed was that although the book purports to be an atheist journalistic investigation into Christianity that led to conversion, Strobel was certainly a believer when he started writing. He says as much himself in the introduction, explaining that he intends to retrace and expand upon the spiritual journey he underwent. Out of 13 interviews in the book, Strobel features not a single skeptic, only Christian apologists, often evangelical ones at that. The author pretends to play devil's advocate at times, but his questions are exceedingly softball. The second thing I noticed was the insignificance of the scientific evidence presented in the book. Strobel and his experts attempt to demonstrate the archaeological accuracy of Scripture through such trivial issues as the Pool of Bethesda and the titles of Roman political officials. What does this have to do with the resurrection, I thought, or with Jesus' identity as the Son of God? Elsewhere, Strobel had argued for the textual consistency of the New Testament, but I had hoped that it would be bolstered by some historical evidence too. The extra-biblical sources cited by Strobel, like Josephus, did strike my curiosity, but upon further investigation of my own, I came to find that the overwhelming majority of historical and biblical scholars consider much of the Josephus passage to be an interpolation, with good reason. It was clear to me that the Case for Christ was more like propaganda than an honest search for the truth. Targeted at Christians looking to reaffirm their faith and find new ways to challenge skeptics, the book would not be persuasive to non-believers, I realized. I continued my search for answers while also striving to grow in faith. As part of getting right with God, I sold off many of the secular albums I owned with the goal of surrounding myself only with things that would edify and strengthen my faith. I made a conscious effort to spend more time around believers, I devoted more of my day to reading the Bible, and I began visiting not just various other youth groups, but various Sunday services as well, to give myself a broader spectrum in which I could grow in my faith. For my second exposure to Christian apologetics, I read Josh McDowell's A Ready Defense at the suggestion of my father. Far more comprehensive in its subject matter than the Case for Christ, McDowell's book came to form the basis of most of my knowledge on apologetics. With chapters on the so-called Bible prophecies, the historicity and virgin birth of Jesus, the resurrection, and various other religions, A Ready Defense was the spark that truly ignited my study of theology and apologetics. It dealt with real arguments I had heard from non-believers, as well as even more sophisticated debates I had not yet encountered. The chapter on Satanism and demonic possession was a little dated and comical, but in general I was impressed by McDowell's work. As I persisted in learning apologetics, I started asking for recommendations from other believers on internet forums. Tectonics.org was the first website I was directed to, with its ever-so-abrasive and smug author J.P. Holding. Although Holding's frequently derisive tone was something I considered to be the opposite of productive in witnessing to non-believers, having a resource like Tectonics where I could go and search for any topic was tremendously helpful. Later on, when another believer recommended ChristianThinkTank.com over Tectonics, I was sold. Glenn Miller, the site's creator, takes a much more civilized and scholarly tone with his articles, and I still believe Christian Think Tank is one of the most respectable works around in Christian apologetics. Through these and other resources, I at last began to find answers to the questions that had plagued my mind. Evil and suffering were the result of humanity's fall into sin, and God allowed bad things to happen to good people because He wanted us to have free will. I was justified in believing the resurrection because of the testimonies in the Gospels, as well as extra-biblical sources, the martyrdom of the disciples, and other details. I knew Jesus was the only way to be saved because while all other religions were about man reaching out to God and doing works to earn salvation, Christianity was about God reaching out to man in grace. The uniqueness of the Christian message, the incompatibility of it with other religions, and Jesus' teaching in John 14:6 were my evidence for the exclusivity of salvation. Feeling revitalized in my beliefs, I began to wonder about my first commitment to Christ. Perhaps all my confusion was because I was not truly saved, since I had been so young at the time. If I couldn't understand what I was doing, how could my heart really have been in it? On the other hand, Christianity minces no words about God being mysterious and beyond our comprehension, so how important is understanding and faith? Passages like Mark 10:14-15 also puzzled me. Because of nothing else, I had definitely had childlike faith when I took my parents at their word without question and prayed to be saved. Did my first commitment count then? It was never an issue I fully settled in on, but nonetheless I made a second commitment to Christ, confessing my sins and doubts, asking for God's saving grace, and renewing my goal to become a man after God's own heart. Passing through such a deep and wide valley had been an emotionally harrowing experience, the first time I knew what other Christians meant when they spoke of being broken down and humbled before God. But God uses broken people, I had been taught, and I found this to be true when I emerged from the valley to begin the ascent of my first mountain.